Fantastic. I think we'll kick off because we only have an hour today to have this very interesting conversation. I hope you're having a very lovely morning. My name is Ingrid Udsundor. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the think tank called Carbon Balance Initiative. And we've invited you all here today for a webinar to talk a bit about our annual report that we've launched with the Article 23 Watch initiative. And we're calling this the first year of Article 23 tracking compliance and progress perspectives on the CO2 injection capacity obligation in the EU. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit. The agenda for today is quite tight. We're going to introduce a few of the key findings in the report. Each of the organizations, so Carbon Balance Initiative, Cleaner Task Force, and Bellona, will speak a little bit about the various sections. Then Toby Lockwood will moderate a panel discussion to discuss some of the key remarks in the report, but also other questions around Article 23. And then you have a chance to ask some questions in a Q&A. However, it will not be with raising your hand and speaking. It's in written format. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom there. The webinar is being recorded, and thus you can always look back if you want. Next slide, please. So today's speakers, I'll introduce them later, but we have a good group of people. It's Toby, William, and me from the Article 23 Watch Initiative. Then we have James, Andrew, Stephanie, and Norbert, who will be panelists together with Toby to discuss. Next slide, please. So just very quickly on who we are and what we're doing. So Article 23 Watch is a joint initiative between the three organizations that we've mentioned. We set up this initiative to really because and Net Zero Industry Act was a very ambitious file that we wanted to track, and specifically to track the Article 23 implementation. So our mission is really to strengthen accountability and transparency across both the industry and member states of how they are implementing the specific article, which is a first of a kind globally on how to develop CO2 storage capacity. Next slide, please. And I hope everyone who's joined today knows what we're talking about when we're talking about Article 23. But in 2024, just as a quick reminder, the EU adopted the Net Zero Industry Act with the aim of boosting Europe's manufacturing and deployment of key net zero technologies, including CCS. And Article 23 was chosen as a regulatory mechanism for scaling the CO2 storage injection capacity as a part of that value chain. It is a first of a kind mechanism, and it places a particular responsibility or obligation on domestic oil and gas producers to develop this CO2 injection capacity by 2030, which is a pro rata obligation of 15 megaton per year capacity. And on that note, next slide, please. We are very excited to talk about our report, which we worked on for months and published in March. And I'll hand over to Toby to kick us off. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ingrid, and thanks, everyone, for joining. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly take us through our analysis of the obligations placed on individual oil and gas producers and how these companies are progressing towards their targets. We can see here 44 entities were identified by the Commission decision issued last year, with obligations ranging from 160,000 tonnes of annual injection capacity to 6.3 million tonnes. As many of these entities are subsidiaries or joint ventures of international national oil and gas companies, we've rationalised them into 27 consolidated entities, which you'll see in later slides. And we've divided the obligation of these joint ventures, such as NAM, which you can see at the top here, according to ownership shares. A few of the entities have been acquired since the 2020 to 2023 assessment period, which was used for the obligation. So their obligations passed the new holder of production licenses. So the consolidated entities, which we'll see in a moment, include well-known players in this sector, such as Shell, TotalEnergies, Exxon, Eni, etc. And these are really the companies which are actively developing CO2 storage capacity. Next slide, please. So to assess how these companies are progressing towards their targets, we looked at CATF's existing database of planned European CO2 storage projects. We identified 20 to 22 storage projects at various stages of development in the EU, of which 19 aiming to have some operational injection capacity by 2030. The 12 projects shown in green here are developed or co-developed by one of the obligated entities, and these projects do tend to be the most advanced. Of course, capacity developed by other entities, shown in orange here, is also available towards the obligation. The public announcements associated with these projects indicate that up to a total of 42.7 million tonnes per year of capacity could be operational by 2030. However, this does reflect a best case scenario for many projects, and there is still significant uncertainty over whether early stage projects will even advance following the site characterization phase. On the other hand, the total capacity deliverable by these sites, which includes their projections post 2030, so their ramp-up projections could reach as high as 90 million tonnes per year. So there is potential for greater capacity to be permitted to receive a storage permit, if not necessarily operational by 2030. Of this capacity, we estimate 5.2 million tonnes is available from sites developed by non-obligated companies. Next slide, please. So just quickly highlighting where this data sits on our website, you can follow the projects and the obligations via this storage tracker app, which also shows storage sites under development in the UK and Norway, and highlights the capacity and obligation associated with each entity. Next slide. So how does this project pipeline compare with each entity's obligation? We apportioned planned capacity between entities, dividing according to ownership shares where necessary. In this graphic, you can see that of the entities with the largest obligations, OMV, Exxon, Orlen, and Romgaz see the largest shortfalls. And in OMV's case, that's primarily through the obligation on its Romanian subsidiary, OMV Petrom. Eni and TotalEnergies are potentially on track to deliver surplus capacity even. And of course, that could be made available to other entities. It's worth highlighting that the large potential excess for Nordsøfonden, which is Denmark's state-owned oil and gas company, is due to their obligatory 20% stake in all Danish storage projects. So that's a bit distorted because where they're in projects with non-obligated entities, we've had to apportion that capacity entirely to Nordsøfonden. This capacity is likely to be made available to other entities if it's realised. Next slide, please. So given nearly all of this capacity was already under development when the regulation was implemented back in 2024, has Article 23 made a discernible impact on the CCS plans of these companies? Just for a bit of context, in the report, we look at how CCS sits within the broader decarbonisation strategies of the producers. Nearly all of the 27 assessed do have commitments to reach net zero scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050, and many highlight CCS as an integral part of their steps towards that goal. CCS is frequently included as part of a broader portfolio of investment commitments in low carbon tech. A smaller group of entities have also various commitments to reach net zero emissions, including scope 3 from products sold. But the notable shifts in CCS development activity can really be seen among the entities in Central and Eastern Europe, which we just saw are facing some of the largest shortfalls. Since 2024, there have been notable increase in efforts by Orlen to develop domestic CO2 storage in Poland, despite a regulatory regime which is currently quite limiting there. In Romania, OMV Petrom have begun work to develop at least one storage site, to our knowledge, while Romgaz has assessed a policy conditional decarbonisation scenario, which includes investments in CCS, partly associated with their own assets. Next slide, please. I'm going to finish this section just quickly by showing how the obligations are distributed according to the country of origin of each obligated entity. So while any entity can develop or reach agreements with capacity anywhere in the EU, this distribution does have implications on the implementing measures each member state needs to take. I'm going to pass on to William Drouet from Bellona Europa to cover our work on tracking that policy progress. Next slide. Over to you, William.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll briefly walk you through the main findings from our first annual review of member states' implementation relevant to Article 23 of the NZIA Industry Act. But first, it should be noted that the first report only looks at the member states hosting registered obligated entities in their territories and does not represent the full picture of all countries that may eventually host storage projects in the future. And another important point is that this assessment is based only on publicly available online sources. So it gives us a good view of the legal and institutional frameworks that are in place, but it does not fully capture how far these measures are already operational in practice. But that being said, the message is quite simple. Progress is being made, but implementation is still uneven across the member states we looked at. Our assessments covered the key provisions that matter at member states level for making Article 23 work in practice and for supporting the objective of reaching 50 million tons per annum of CO2 injection capacity by 2030. That includes provisions like single points of contact, online access to information, administrative support, priority status and planning and permitting timelines, transparency and annual reporting, transport infrastructure and access, and last but not least, penalties. These provisions are part of the enabling framework behind Article 23. For example, they help make project development more predictable. They reduce administrative complexity. They improve visibility on storage opportunities and help creating the conditions for a functioning CO2 market across Europe. And within that overall picture, 3 countries stand out most clearly at this stage. Denmark standing out for having the most complete one-stop shop approach, the Netherlands performing strongly on permitting and digital access, and Germany stands out for its legal framework, especially on priority treatment and penalties. So overall, the direction of travel is positive, but implementation is still not yet consistent across member states. Next slides, please. In the interest of time, instead of reviewing each country individually, I'll highlight the main gaps we identified and where they are critical for effective implementation of Article 23. But the detailed and more comprehensive country findings are set out in our member states implementation tracker that we published last December. So the first gap is administrative support. This needs to be addressed because projects require clarity and a manageable pathway to support smooth development. And without practical guidance and coordination, project delivery risk becoming slower and unnecessarily burdensome. The second gap is binding permitting timelines. Unclear and unreliable timelines make it difficult to advance projects with confidence. And in general, clear timelines are a key part of turning policy ambition into actual delivery. The third gap is transport infrastructure and access. And this is especially important because the implementation of Article 23 will not only depend on storage sites themselves, it depends on a value chain, that connects capture, transport, and storage projects, and often across borders. So if transport frameworks and access rules are still fragmented, that makes it harder to develop a functioning CO2 market at the EU level. And the fourth gap is penalties. And this is particularly important because penalties are part of what will give Article 23 real effects. They help ensure that the obligation is backed by a credible enforcement framework and implemented consistently. So the main takeaway here is pretty straightforward. The criteria we analyzed are the practical conditions that help make Article 23 work effectively and strengthen the enabling framework needed to support delivery of the 2030 objective. And this is why our recommendation to member states is to continue implementation in a practical and consistent way by putting in place robust and dissuasive penalties, removing legal barriers, improving access to geological data, opening exploration areas, and expanding permitting capacity. And to conclude, this first report shows clear progress. This is encouraging, but at the same time, it also shows that further work is still needed to make implementation more consistent across member states. And the key step is really to continue translating the NZIA into practical national frameworks that can support effective implementation of Article 23 and of course the gradual development of a functioning European CO2 market. That's it for me. Thank you. And I hand it over to Ingrid.
Thank you, William. Next slide, please. So we've tracked entities and storage projects. We've tracked what is happening in member states. And then in our group, we thought it actually is very interesting to talk to the ecosystem and try to understand what the stakeholder perspectives are on this Article 23. So we decided to interview experts and industrial emitters, civil society, some member state representatives, and we also interviewed one obligated entity. That was 17 interviews across 22 different organizations within the EU. And there's, in the report, you can see sort of 4 buckets, if you want. There are several subchapters of findings, and the overall finding is that stakeholders are broadly supportive of Article 23, so quite positive, actually, that this is something that could drive CCS in Europe forward. But concerns were raised regarding clarity on the regulation, and then, of course, also some elements of different opinions on the design, so specific design choices. But the first is the rationale and legitimacy. So 13 out of 17 stakeholders expressed quite strong support for Article 23, even though they raised some concerns. One of the things that was highlighted again in various interviews was that it has been, it's a measure that can overcome the long-standing sort of deadlock, or chicken and egg, which is usually mentioned in the CCS value chain. There was also a quite strong sentiment of support to that placing the obligation on the upstream oil and gas entities makes sense. They have the technical expertise and the financial capacity to look at these large-scale infrastructure projects. And then the regulation is broadly viewed as going in positive direction in terms of investment signal. There was questions about implementation risks and sovereignty considerations, raising particularly sort of the element of what the different capacities to tailor this implementation is between member states in the EU. On the data and methodology, there was again quite a strong support for pro rata production-based allocation. There was again, or concerns around the methodology, so not necessarily the pro rata, but the fact that it didn't consider the varying levels of CCS being ready in various different member states, so the regulatory maturity and subsidy availability. Stakeholders reported insufficient transparency on the data used by the Commission. And that was sort of the elements under the methodology that became clear throughout the interviews. The clarity on definitions is definitely a theme throughout the interviews. So uncertainty was raised regarding the definition of compliance, which I know has been discussed quite often around Article 23. There was also a definitional clarity question, or lack of clarity, that was raised often by around what it actually leads to when it comes to some of these investments decisions. There is still also quite a strong ask that penalties and what is defined as reasonable effort, but potentially for derogations, etc., is quite needed urgently, and particularly on penalties, to make the investment decisions clearer as well. The final thing which might be raised in the panel is the comparability, or the worry by some that there will be fragmentation and penalty design between member states. So different member states will go for different options, which might have a risk or unintended consequence to it. And then finally, which I think Toby will also raise in the panel, is there was, and William mentioned it now, on value chain readiness. There was 2 points that was frequently raised, which is the 2030 target feasible given the storage project timeline and pipeline? Is also the transport infrastructure or supporting infrastructure ready to support these projects around 2030 and beyond? So that's the overall on stakeholder support, but generally very interesting to interview the ecosystem on these issues. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through these in very much detail because Toby will cover them in the panel, but we came up with 5 recommendations given what we've analyzed on the topics that we have presented today. So one is that the European Commission should clarify how compliance with Article 23 will be assessed. The second is that there should be more clarity and guidance on penalty design to member states, but also between member states from the Commission and maybe from some leading member states. The European Commission should enable and clarify how agreements with third-party storage developers can count towards the compliance, also be designed and fast-tracked, which I know will be discussed at the panel today. And then, of course, there was this bigger recommendation of we need these penalties to be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive, and keep to the timeline that is stated in the regulation in June this year. And then I think this goes without saying, but member states, of course, must enable these storage development processes to happen with it, which is what Bellona and William highlighted today, which is there is a lot of enabling structures around that needs to be put in place to fast track this towards 2030, but also afterwards. Next slide, please. I'll now hand over to Toby to moderate the panel with our very good speakers. So we have Stephanie Hiesinger, Head of Unit for Low Carbon Solutions, Research and Low Carbon Technology Deployment at DG Klima. We have Norbert Gerner, who is in the Division for Market Framework for Industrial Decarbonization and Carbon Management at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. We have Andrew Kavanagh, who is a net zero policy and storage expert at the Scottish CCS Institute and Edinburgh Climate Change Institute. And then we have James Coogan, who is the Carbon Markets Regulation and Renewables Lead at Danube Carbon and Clonbio Group. So I'll hand over to you now, Toby, to kick off the panel. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to all the speakers so much for joining us today. I think we're going to kick off with a perspective from Stephanie and DG Klima. Yeah, it would be great if to have some background on the motivation and rationale for this storage obligation, as well as any updates on its implementation and reactions to our report, particularly with respect to our recommendations. Over to you, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Toby, and thanks also for the opportunity to join this panel today. Let me start by congratulating you on your report. It's really a comprehensive piece of work and also a good input into the discussion. If you look at Article 23 of NZIA, this is very much built on the desire of the legislature to instill transparency into the process, and I think this report really contributes to creating that transparency. So very welcome from our side that you also look at these important questions. Article 23 of NZIA itself is, of course, and I think we cannot get tired of underlining it, a landmark step in the CCS landscape. Also, your report refers to that. It is Europe's first binding obligation to build CO2 storage and create a corresponding market. And that is not small. This is what we will need to do. Our analysis for the climate target as enshrined in the climate law show that we will need more and more CO2 also to be captured and stored underground and also used. So the figures are in the relevant impact assessments. I will not repeat them, but this is really important that we get this right as a decarbonization pathway for our industries. So in terms of the progress, well, in just 1 year, we have already see quite some tangible momentum. Projects are advancing, investments are being mobilized. Also, well, we see that very much under the applications that come to our innovation fund as well. And also policy alignment is improving. But then there is progress, but your report provides quite some useful reality check, because your report is clear. Progress is there, but it is uneven. And at the current pace, we risk missing the 2030 target. So we will come forward with our own report. So we have an obligation under NZIA also to present a report, and we are at in the final stages of preparing it. It is based on the confidential reports that the obligated entities have sent to us, but it is forthcoming, and then it will be good to compare notes. I think key priorities, looking also at your report, are clear. So we must clarify the rules. Industry needs predictability to be able to become compliant. And we have, from the Commission, always been working towards that direction, also clarifying the provisions of NZIA itself when it comes to CCS. Then member states must accelerate permitting and coordination. That is also clear, and also there we try, not least with NZIA, to support that process. Then credible penalty regimes are essential to ensure delivery. For the Article 23 obligation, we do not have a harmonized penalty regime, so member states develop those penalties at national level. We try to coordinate as much as we can on the side of the Commission with the member states, but your report shows that credible penalties in particular are really essential. And then we need full value chain development. We need to think capture, transport, and storage together. And I think that is very clear. And I'm actually happy that under the Innovation Fund, we by now have one full value chain CCS project in our portfolio, which is also a good signal that more and more full value chain development is happening. As I said, transparency is at the heart of Article 23, and we also want to continue to instill that transparency. We are working on an online tool for facilitating the reporting from the obligated entities and also member states to the Commission. That will not mean that all the information that is provided via that tool will be immediately available to everyone, but that would facilitate greatly providing the information to us and then us preparing relevant reports. So we are working on that as well. Well, you all know we are also faced with legal challenges on Article 23. So this is part of the process, but the obligation stands, and I think our collective commitment to compliance also stands. Article 23, just to conclude, I want to highlight, is really not just a regulation from our perspective. It is a market signal that should unlock CCS and decarbonize the hard-to-abate industries that we have in Europe. And therefore, we really do not consider this simply another regulation. Progress has been made. It is uneven, so the next 2-3 years in our view will determine the success of the Net Zero Industry Act when it comes to the 50 million ton target. So with coordinated action, we can deliver. We are confident that we can deliver, but we need to continue the progress that we have been making so far and tackle the barriers that may still exist. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that perspective, and I'd like to come back on a few of those points later, but we'll move on through the panel and get a member state perspective from Norbert, and thanks for joining, Norbert. So as we've seen, the German government has been a first mover particularly in designing a penalty regime for non-compliance under Article 23. I think it was maybe well timed with the amendment to the CO2 Storage Act, which was passed last year in Germany. Can you talk a bit about what that penalty design looks like and how Germany thought about developing that regime? And perhaps more broadly, given we're seeing quite a bit of variation across member states, do you see a role for first movers like Germany sharing experience and helping to ensure we have a bit more of a harmonized penalty implementation across the EU?
Okay, thank you very much. And to start also from my side with thanks for preparing this report. I think that is a good basis to look at how the implementation has started. From our side, maybe just as introductory remarks, I mean, the implementation in Germany was guided by the goal to reach the objectives of the Net Zero Industry Act on CCS, specifically the annual injection capacity of 15 million tons. And in a broader context, it is also our aim to contribute to develop a full value chain. And there, the storage point is essential. That is quite clear. Now to come to the implementation of Article 23, as you mentioned, on the timeline, it came together with the amendment of the Carbon Dioxide Storage Act. So it was a good opportunity already to implement Article or to take essential steps for the implementation of Article 23 in that. So to start, it's in paragraph 24 of the Carbon Dioxide Storage and Transport Act right now. And essentially, it means that there will be a payment obligation per ton of annual carbon dioxide injection capacity that is not created for each year in which the contribution has not been made. It says that there is a maximum of the penalty defined, which is €100 plus an inflation compensation. It also says with regard to the goal of the penalty regime, in particular to skim off the economic benefits associated with non-performance or incomplete or late performance. That are the guiding principles. And it says also clearly that now this is in the Carbon Dioxide Storage Act, which is a law which was at the end adopted by Parliament, but it gives also the authority to our ministry, together with the Ministry for the Environment and with the consent of our federal chamber, to issue a regulation on the basis of this parliamentary law that will regulate the details on the execution of penalties. And it is important to stress that the €100 plus inflation adjustment is a maximum amount. So it will be up later to decide that it could be also less than this maximum. And so that is also clearly said in the law. Maybe just then with regard to your question, I mean, the situation for first mover for us, it was really with regard to the timeline, a good coincidence that at the same time we changed the legal framework to allow CCS over the whole value chain, storage and transport by pipeline in Germany practically, and at the same time also to implement the principles of the Article 23 Net Zero Industry Act. And from our perspective, it would be for the process to continue right now, really to work on sharing experience between member states at the European level, and also at the end to have a really consistent way of moving forward on that over Europe. So thank you very much.
Thanks, that's helpful. Just quickly to clarify or to get a little bit more information on the kind of flexibility you mentioned. the penalty's been defined as a maximum amount. Have you had any thought to what kind of circumstances might lead to reductions below that amount, or what authority do you feel the member state has to exercise that kind of flexibility with respect to the penalties?
That will have to be decided in a regulation, really, to fix the amount. But I think one important aspect is clearly regulated in the law, that it is on to skim off the economic benefits that would be associated with non-performance or incomplete or late performance. So it's clearly linked to the fact that at the end it is the NZIA Industry Act. We see it as a mean to get the CCS value chain started and to reach the annual injection capacity. So that is the goal, and only we want to support these who really follow that goal. And if there should be a problem, it clearly says that the benefit you would have if you would not follow the goal, that should be skimmed off.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come to James now. Thanks for joining, James. So for those of you who don't know, the Danube Carbon Storage Project is a storage project which is currently under development in Hungary, and James leading that work. It would be great to hear your perspective as what you might call a third-party storage developer, not an obligated entity, and what kind of engagement you've been having with obligated entities on potentially exchanging that capacity which is under development, and what a workable third-party agreement might look like in practice. Oh, I think you're muted, James.
Thanks, Toby, and thanks to everybody. What you're doing here, by the way, is very important, because there isn't a huge amount of time between now and 2030 or 2031. And what you guys are doing is facilitating a much quicker and better engagement and flow of information, and that needs to be done as much as possible, and what your Article 23 initiative is very valuable in that. And so I'd encourage you to do lots more of the same. So yes, we're a third-party developer, so we're not an obligated entity. We've a 500,000 ton under development at the moment, which is expected to be ready by 2030. So, in very straightforward way, it's compliant, assuming that the geological subsurface evaluations that are currently underway continue to be positive, and assuming that the project overall does reach commercial viability. And so what I would say to you is that, going back to your slide about your recommendations on the fifth one about member state supports, the single biggest thing missing in this whole picture for an obligated entity, and you have to put yourselves in their minds, is that nobody wants to spend money developing a hole in the ground that nothing will go into and that will not be commercially viable. So a lot of the obligated entities operate in countries where there aren't any CCS subsidies. There aren't huge big government programs to support it. And essentially, we're all looking at a situation which we could be developing CCS injection wells that don't have a commercial viability. And so as much as the penalties might act as a very compelling stick to get people to act, and that is a very positive impact of Article 23, is that it's generated a whole load of very intense feasibility study activity around Europe. The feasibility studies, if they all result generally in a lack of feasibility for a mix of mainly commercial reasons, and then a number of permitting and other regulatory reasons, then the penalties alone, just as a blunt brute force mechanism, will struggle to deliver a result. So the single most important thing that regulators across Europe can do as soon as possible is issue very strong signals that CCS will actually be something commercially viable by the early 30s, so that when all the obligated entities are complying with it, they're also looking at something that will actually be of benefit for them. Because ultimately, what you're looking at here is a a regulatory obligation that arose on the basis of historical activities. It's acting as a kind of a future tax. That in itself is something that would stick, would have difficulty being kind of digested by boards of most companies. And I work for a company, our board wouldn't be comfortable with it. And they're evaluating it and saying, okay, so we have this regulation, but what are we going to get at the end of it? It's a very rational, constructive way of looking at it, is that the obligation shouldn't just be a penalty. It should be something constructive. And so the whole thing would have a lot more wind behind it if we were all looking at a system in which this injection capacity was going to be commercially viable by the time it came on stream, and not simply a penalty avoidance mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'd like to quickly come back on that, perhaps hand over to Stephanie as well, before we go to Andrew, because I think we often hear this message that we need the business case for the full value chain. And of course we do. And there are various subsidies available at the EU and national level, which are probably still inadequate for most projects. But what is the net zero industry acts obligation achieving if we still need to put in place the same kind of incentives that everyone was looking for before? I mean, my interpretation might be that the hope is that the regulation, the stick, can induce companies to take on a bit more risk, maybe speed up projects, maybe accept lower returns. I don't know. How can we ensure
there's no question about that the Act has stimulated a lot of exploration of the commercial and technical viability of CCS. We've spoken with all the obligated entities. We're engaging with several of them in a very intense way. There's a lot of very genuine effort going on to discover whether or not our project is feasible technically, and then whether it's going to be viable commercially as well, because we're not going to be able to develop a partnership with an obligated entity for compliance if they don't believe that that project is going to be viable by the time we go into production. For the most part, a partnership compliancy agreement with a third party like us is going to be based on the obligated entity looking at us and saying, well, is their project going to be viable technically? And there is some risk in that because it's not operating right now. It still has to go through the test well phase. And valuing the compliancy, how much is it worth to do a partnership with a third party? How much is it going to, what's it worth to us? How do you value compliancy? At the moment, that's not something that anybody can value with any great certainty, because the penalties aren't announced and because the value of a CCS project is unknown, because there's so little commercial activity around CCS projects right now. But obviously the core issue of looking about strict compliance unit agreement, which is difficult in itself because of the technical and value assessment around it. But anybody who we're talking to is interested in what's beyond compliancy. It's not just about compliancy, but how is this a positive, attractive project to get into that has scope for expansion, has scope for repaying what it costs to do it, to build itself. Is it replicable? How is it? What are the risks? And that's the mindset of everybody looking at it. Is, yeah, sure, the threat of penalty has stimulated activity, but the real activity is trying to come up with projects that are viable anyway.
Yeah, that remains the issue. I think a positive aspect of having this, I would hope, greater clarity around the availability of a storage pipeline towards 2030, a kind of maybe more dependable pipeline of projects, is I think it will promote the development of these kind of business models and incentives at the member state level, because I think countries have long been looking for more confidence that storage will be available to their industries that they would aim to subsidize. But
I don't want to eat up any more time, but just if I get to the very simple point, I mean, the single biggest factors that have been driven decarbonisation in Europe has been the cost of energy compared to outside of Europe. So you're always competing at people with lower energy prices. So you reduce your energy consumption in Europe, and ETS. So they're the things that have driven the 40% drop in reduction since 1990. And so obviously nobody wants to see more cost going into the system, but ETS has been an effective thing. For our own project, with or without the Article 23 kind of additional mechanism in it, some strong ETS development signals that would be in support of CCS and support of carbon removals with ETS, that would really move this on beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for sure, this is not, it's important to be clear, this is not expected to be a sunk cost for these obligated entities. It's, the intent is to create a new business and a new revenue stream. But I'll come to Andrew now, who's done some great research on looking at possible storage capacity in Europe, and in the context of this target. Sandra, if you can give your view on the feasibility of the identified project pipeline ramping up in time to meet this target, and also the developer's own targets, which have been reflected in our own research.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's been a long conversation between us on that. We put out a paper last year on storage supply in Europe and capture demand. So really like that push-pull. And I would say in the 2010s, there were some very loose numbers out there. And you frequently come across this up to capacity number, and that means different things to different people. If you're in operational storage capacity, that's pretty much what's called the nameplate capacity, and so you could say Sleipner is up to 1 million tons a year, Snøhvit's up to 0.7 million tons a year. You can look at Quest too. When you go into their operational history, they frequently operate at about 70 to 80% of capacity, and that's not unusual. So that's I would say that's a useful number. When you get into projects that are really at the sharp end of FEED, approaching FID, or in the construction phase, they will have an up to number, which you could call a P10. But it's quite a firm number. So there's an expectation that the operation will perform in a certain way, and that has an upside and a downside, and that gives you a range, and that's very familiar to the obligated entities as oil and gas companies. So they will, when they're really very, very close to, say, an investment decision or close to going into operation, they will have an expectation, and it will be a P90 and a P50 and a P10. And so that's really what we looked at in the paper in terms of what storage is available. And then you get into a much looser set of numbers, which is really around projects being announced and engaging with the public. And obviously they want to put a sort of the biggest number on it as possible because it's dramatic, it gets interest. Those up to numbers are not very useful, but they do end up in capacity estimates, so aggregated capacity estimates like status reports or atlases, and they really need to be challenged. So when you come to 2030 and NZIA and that 50 million ton a year injection capacity, it's very, very important that there are there's clarity, there are very clear definitions on what is meant by injection capacity and how that sits with these numbers that are, particularly when you're, say, in feasibility or in early risk assessment, can be quite misleading. And so I would advocate for the adoption of, say, the SRMS approach. So that's the Storage Resource Management System, which is published by the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And it's very clear in terms of P90, P50, P10, what the expected capacity is for a project and how that matures through its development. So I would say for 2030 at the moment, our analysis showed that the industry as a whole would have to accelerate to reach 50 million tons a year. And although it was within our expected range, it would require, timelines to be shortened, coordination between the regulators and the entities and the market generally. And so I think there's substantial work to be done there. And, that target looks challenging, but not impossible. And it would, I think, take a concerted effort and good faith actions on the part of the obligated entities to get, very close to that 50 million tons a year, which your most recent research, and it's in the Article 23 Watch report, is I think above 40 million tons a year, and we're still 4 years out. So I don't think the target's impossible, but we definitely need to see acceleration and concerted effort, and I would say goodwill.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'd like to come back to Stephanie, maybe partly for your reflections on what's been said so far, but also just to have a sense of how the Commission thinks this regulation, this stick, as we describe it, on storage development can really tangibly accelerate this project progress. Because I think it's important to recognize that most of these projects were around in 2024, many in 2023 or before. And I think there was a real concern that storage can keep on waiting for a great business case, for great policy support through subsidies to emitting industries. Can the regulation act to, we still need those things, but can the regulation act in such a way perhaps that we need less than we might have otherwise done, or that timeline of policy development or projects progress can go a little bit quicker than it was before? So do you feel the regulation is having a tangible impact on how that project pipeline advances?
Toby, let me start by saying that I think it's quite important what James also underlined, that of course in the end those projects need a business case. It's not about only this being a stick and we ask for complying with an obligation just for the sake of complying with that obligation. So what we want to create is a market for CO2 storage in the EU. And we don't want to create that because we woke up yesterday and thought it's a good idea, but we know it's a necessity as we move forward on the way towards our climate targets, and to provide decarbonization options to our industries. And those industries, because the business case for me, it's not just also wishful thinking. We are already actively supporting the business case for CO2 storage from the Innovation Fund. We have, these projects, that capture projects in our portfolio, which means there are industries and industrial players out there that actively look for storage options. And we see more and more of those projects coming, which means that more and more projects will be looking for storage. So this is where I think, it's not yet there. I mean, I have no illusion the business case is not yet fully there. There's, barriers to it, such as infrastructure and other things, permitting. We mentioned ample times, but we are working on it. We will come forward also with, for example, a regulatory framework on CO2 transport later this year. So this is, I think, it's a strategy and a coherent approach that we are taking. So I think it's really important to underline that, the business case is important, but we also see it and support it from the side of the EU, which is only the public side of things. So of course we are also looking at private investors coming forward there. And that is, I think, what what characterizes Article 23 of NZIA, and I said it, in my remarks, it's not just a regulation. We have an ETS that is, going to be revised as well. That also is part of the business case of these capture installations, and hence also of the business case of the future storage sites. Are we okay?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think, especially in the context of the legal challenges which have been mentioned in some of the questions as well, I think it's really important to highlight that this target or something close to it, well, firstly, we know we need to realize it. I think the obligation can only help with that, but we do need to work together, member states, obligated entities, other storage developers, to really plot a rational and real pathway towards how we can realize this pipeline, which is already there, as we've shown. How we can bring that forward in time. Let's maybe try to quickly.
If I can just add, because you asked me, is it, are we making progress? And I do think we are making progress. I mean, your report testifies it. I can tell you that from the Commission's perspective, we have seen, requests for exploration permits and for non-binding opinions that we provide under the CCS directive increasing in numbers since the adoption of the Net Zero Industry Act. So, I think there's a lot of debate happening in the member states, but there's also a lot of tangible, steps being taken, and more of that will have to come in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great data point. I mean, yeah, I hope the report stresses that we have definitely seen, and James mentioned as well, we've definitely seen an upsurge in activity in storage development. Of course, there's little time left, but faster is always better, and we do have a lot in the pipeline. I think we're going to need to wrap up. So thank you very much to all the panelists. I hope you made all the points you wanted to make. I'm going to hand over to Ingrid to wrap up and talk about next steps for Article 23 Watch.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you all for the panelists. I'm also just going to do a couple of reflections, and maybe it's just reiterating what Stephanie and Toby just confirmed now. Progress is happening, and you see that in our report when you look at the pipeline of projects in the pipeline, but you also see that with stakeholders actually emphasizing throughout our interviews that people are coming to the table. People are talking, people are discussing, people are trying to find solutions. And I think Andrew highlighted this. The target is not impossible, but action needs to happen in the next 3 years. There is a lot that would need to happen, both on sort of projects running quicker, but also the goodwill of the actors involved across the value chain. And I'm going to highlight 3 points that I think I heard through the panel discussion. So one is, yes, the litigation cases are happening, but the obligation is still in effect throughout this process. So it's important to continue and pushing with speed. The penalty regimes are important, and clarity and incredible penalty regimes, such as the ones we're seeing in Germany, are important that are continuously discussed and implemented across member states. But it's not the only measure. We also need to have a business case and a commercial signal, which this Article 23 and the Net Zero Industry Act is supposed to give the investment signal of what is to come in the 2030s. And then finally, I want to emphasize the point that Stephanie raised in her final remark. The demand is increasing, so emitters are looking to store, and they need more access to storage, and that's the main objective of this act. I'm going to say thank you so much to everyone. Article 23 Watch is really, really appreciative of engaging with everyone in this room and many of you that have attended the webinar. We will continue to publish stuff on Article 23, which is our job in this project. We have recently published a penalty briefing that just summarizes a few options, and we also have recently published a amicus briefing on the legal cases where you can see some of our analysis on the arguments that are put forward in the legal cases. So do follow us. You can see here our website URL, but also on LinkedIn, and much more to come. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely Wednesday afternoon.